Welcome to podcast number 62 for Thanks for Your Service, Anzac Day, 25th of April 2023. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net and you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. I recently came across a comprehensive research project on the 22nd Battalion of the First Australian Imperial Force whilst doing some research on my grandfather's service in World War I. The project's author, Greg Stevens, tells us about the project and his grandfather's service. Joining us on the line from Surrey in the United Kingdom is Greg Stevens. Greg, thank you very much for joining us this morning, your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me today.
I came across your project and website while doing some research on my own grandfather, who was at Gallipoli land on the 26th of April. But you've authored a project called Following the 22nd. What is the project about?
Well, simply, it's a First World War centenary commemorative project that follows an Australian infantry battalion through the Great War. And in this case, it's the Victorian Rays 22nd Battalion, simply because that's who my grandfather signed up with and fought with. So more about him later. Now, the thing about the project is that it utilizes sources from various places. So, for example, I've got battalion diaries, I've got brigade diaries, I've got Red Cross files for the missing, medal citations, which are all found on the Australia War Memorial website. For those killed in action and those that died of their wounds, we have the Commonwealth War Graves Commission records. I've got personal letters as well, which I spent best part of a week and a half down in the archives of the AWM in Canberra to go through those, to bring out, letters from the front, etc. Of course, Charles Bean's official history is great to go for. And then also sort of what's really started off was the book by Captain Gorman, which was with the 22nd. And that formed the basis of my understanding about what the battalion did. And alongside that, or layering on top, were the service records of the soldiers. And having, as you can tell, I live here. I am British. I've lived here all my life. If we want to do research on British soldiers, it's a lot more difficult than it is with the Australians. I was absolutely amazed the amount of detail that is there, that are available for anyone wishing to do their research for Australians. So I had all these bits and pieces together, and really it's a case of trying to turn over as many of the pieces of the jigsaw as possible to get a clearer picture about what our ancestors went through during the Great War. And I think because what I did is I focused very much on the centenary period. So I had all these buckets of information that were there, and I loaded them up onto the website on the centenary of when they happened. So we actually had a sort of a time-lapse project, and I would think that possibly this is the most complete set of data brought together in a time-lapse way that's ever been done on an Australian unit. But that was really during the centenary period. But also what I've done is to provide a little bit of background, is also put down where the men trained, the hospitals they went to, the transport ships they went on as well. So it has a broader reach and interest to not just people within the 22nd, is beyond that as well. And then also today, this website is a forum for families wishing to share their own stories. So I have many personal stories that are up there with personal photographs and memorabilia as well. So it's an ongoing sort of collection, really, of the time that the men spent there.
And you said that this project was a centenary project. When did you start putting it together?
Right. Well, okay. I started pretty much in about 10 years ago now, about 2013. But it really started in about 2010. My grandfather, George Stevens, he was born in Port Melbourne. All we knew about him is that he had signed up underage. He had been wounded 4 times. He went absent without leave. He got court-martialed, and he got the military medal. And probably most importantly, he met a lovely young lady from Twickenham that he ended up marrying. So that's all we knew, but that was it. But then in about 2010, one of my brothers pointed out that he had found my grandfather's service records online, and there were 60 odd pages of it there. So I started going through, and we were just approaching my dad's 80th birthday. So I said, right, okay, what we're going to do, I'm going to do some research, get all this information together, and I arranged a guided battlefield tour of France and Belgium to go around. And basically from that point, I was hooked. So I thought, okay, we got the centenary coming up. What can I do? So I thought, first of all, about writing a blog about my grandfather and putting up that. But then, as I had his service records complete, I started to look at the other 153 men of the 5th Reinforcements that he signed up with. How many of those records were there? And guess how many I found? 153. So suddenly I had real detailed information on a whole set of reinforcements, the 5th Reinforcements. So basically, going from what I thought was going to be a blog, I ended up doing this this project because it grew and grew and grew. And I think if my wife was listening to now, she would say she basically lost for me for about 5 years while I was doing all the research and putting it up.
So obviously your grandfather, George Stevens, was part of the motivation for you to create the project.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah.
And he was part of the 5th Reinforcements. Did they all go into the 22nd Battalion, or what was their sort of history or the linkage to the 22nd Battalion?
Well, so at the time when my grandfather enlisted, this was in July 1915, and this was just right during the time of what I would call the great recruitment drive that was taking place across Australia. The first wave had all signed up for Gallipoli, but then things started to slow down, and I think the authorities were looking at Victoria in particular and thinking they weren't doing a very good job. So there was a massive recruitment going on at that time. So my grandfather signed up there, and men were signed, thousands of men were signing up, and they would be assigned to a set of reinforcements to a particular battalion. So this group, this cohort of 154 men, all signed up within probably, or the majority of them within probably a 2 to 3 week window, and they went off to Broadmeadows in I think late August 1915, and started to train together. So they went across, they sailed across to Egypt, because that was where they were at that time thinking that they may well be reinforcing the men that were over on the Gallipoli Peninsula at that time. But of course, the evacuation had taken place, so they met up with the rest of the battalion when they were in the desert. So some of that 154 went off into different units, because also what was taking place at that time was a bit of a weeding out process, because it was great the response that the men had made, and Australia had made at this particular time, but not everyone was really cut out for fighting on the front line. My grandfather, he had only just turned 17 when he signed up. So he's not far past his 16th birthday. We hear a lot about underage soldiers. What we don't hear so much is the other end. So there are men in their 40s and 50s as well. So during the time in Egypt, they then put people into different units that were probably more suited. The pioneers started, for example, and then of course there was the creation of the 4th and 5th divisions. So they needed men as well. So not all of those 154 stayed together, but I would say a good 3/4 of them did, and I've recorded their whole time together.
So if we focus on your grandfather, so George joined the Fifth Reinforcements. He went
Yeah.
to Egypt in about, was it August or September
Well,
1915?
that's when they went to Broadmeadows, and then
Broadmeadows.
they sailed in September 1915. So they would have got across to Egypt about the October time, I think it is. And then in early January, that's when the boys came back from Gallipoli. And I think it must have been quite a shocking time for them because, they had just endured 3 months of hell over there, with the disease and the weather, etc., etc. So many had lost weight, but that's where they started to get amalgamated in. And the time in Egypt was spent really in the canal zone, preparing defenses, because at that time they thought the Turks may well come down through Palestine and attack the Suez Canal. So they worked on different defenses there, including trenches in the desert. They had a sandstorm. They all went back to camp, went back to find the trenches. They'd all gone. They'd all been filled in by sand. So that was a pointless exercise that was learned. And then they decided to redo the defenses on what would be the western side of the canal at that time. So they stayed there until March, and then the call came for the AIF to set sail for the Western Front. And the 2nd Division, they were the first division to go across to France, and the 22nd were one of the first of the division too. So they set sail on the Landouverie Castle and arrived in Marseille on the 26th of March in 1916. So one of the first ones in, and then they headed north up to French Flanders, around Armentières, around that area, and it was known as the nursery sector because it was a quiet sector at that particular time, and the British Army decided to put a lot of the newer units, because coming from Britain at the time were the PALS battalions as well, or the great recruitment was taking place there. So they cut their teeth up there, but really it was just getting used to trench life up there. So they spent a couple of months in that particular area, and then of course with the summer coming in 1916, preparations were being made for the Great Somme Offensive of the 1st of July. And so they got involved in doing some trench raiding at that time in order to try to keep the Germans on their toes, not knowing what was going to be taking place. And then 1st of July, the Great Offensive started. And then by sort of mid-July, the Australian division started to head south from French Flanders down to the Somme. And the 2nd Division, so the 22nd amongst them, went into Poitiers on the 28th, 29th of July, 1916. And that was a baptism of fire that no one, the boys in Gallipoli, I think they were all pretty, felt as though they were set aside from the rest of the reinforcements, but Poitiers was a great leveler. I mean, it's the most heaviest bombarded place on the whole of the British front at that particular time. Many men were killed there, and also shell shock. And I know that my grandfather was there because one of the things I was able to do is going through the Red Cross files of men that were missing. I actually came across an interview they had with my grandfather in hospital when he was in Bristol, which actually said that he had seen this particular soldier fall as they were attacking what was known as OG2. It's the second line of defense going through, German defense going through Poitiers on the 5th of August. So that was a great way of me actually being able to physically put my grandfather at that particular point, as opposed to just conjecture. So that's so he started off there. He got through Poitiers fine. Then they stayed. They were in the Flers area, and that's when, of course, the winter was coming and all the mud was coming. It was the atrocious conditions. But on the 13th of November, his luck ran out, and he was out in the open when he got hit by shrapnel from a shell. So off he went to hospital, across to England. went to the camps in Weymouth and Wiltshire, recuperated, back out to the front in March 1917. And within 2 days of being out there in the Somme area, again, he was hit by shrapnel, this time in the foot. He got a blighty one and went back home. And for him, I think it was a relatively minor wound, but it did see him out of the frame for quite some time, as the Australian units were regrouping in 1917 in preparation for Third AIF. They didn't put all the men back. And I think a certain amount of boredom crept in over there. Cutting a long story short here, it did have an impact on discipline, and together with what we found out to be his best mate from the 22nd, a guy called Charles Samways, the two of them went absent without leave in August and September 1917 for 6 weeks. And it's an incredible amount of time. Now, in the research that I was able to do, I found that the English side of the family, so this was my grandfather's father's family, were hoteliers in West London. So amongst them, they owned the Drayton Court Hotel, which in 1914 had a certain Vietnamese man working in the kitchens. And I ask everyone, can you name a famous Vietnamese person? And there's only one that most people come up with: Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh worked in the kitchens of one of our relatives. This was while he was traveling around France and England and the US, building up his life, really.
Yeah.
So there was that. They developed a theatre, the Lyric Theatre in Ealing. They had a gentleman's club, smoking room, pool, and then they also owned a hotel in Twickenham called the Eel Pie Island. Now, some people listening today might be aware of the Eel Pie Island, particularly if they are followers or fans of The Who and the Rolling Stones, because in the 1960s, that's where they used to do their rock gigs. But at that time, during the First World War, it was tea rooms and for tea dancing. And my grandmother, a young lady, used to come along, and that's where they met. So I do say, that being a 19-year-old that overseas, that had been wounded twice, with all this free entertainment and a girlfriend, who wouldn't want to stay AWOL for a period of time? But the amazing thing is that neither him nor Charles were court-martialed at this particular time. The Australians had already made the rules more lax. So if you went AWOL for 3 weeks, then you were unlikely to get court-martialed. 6 weeks, I haven't come across anyone like that. My only feeling is that the Aussies were running out of men, and they needed everyone to go back to the front. Now, just as a side here, as part of all my research, I've actually written a paper on discipline within the Australians on the Western Front, which is available on the website. And there is a YouTube presentation that I delivered to the Western Front Association a couple of years or so ago. So I thought that would, consider we got skin in the game as a family, that would be a good one. So George and Charles, they were sent back to the front. They rejoined the battalion up in Belgium and in the winter of 1917. And then, of course, in spring of 1918, the Germans had their last throw of the dice before the Americans arrived with their German spring offensive. So the Australian Corps moved south to shore up the area around the Somme. All the old battlefields that they had fought over in 1916 and 17 were now in German hands. And the 22nd Battalion, they relieved the 45th Battalion. So I think many people would have read Private Lynch's Somme Mud, his memoirs, that they relieved the 45th there. And then on the 8th of April, in a shell hole, George got hit for the third time, this time through the chest, bullet wound. He probably thought, well, I'm still alive. It means I can go back to England again. But no, what they did this time is they just went up to northern France, into the hospitals, into the recuperation centres there, patched him up, back to the front for the summer. He was involved in the successful attack at Ville-sur-Ancre, which is the battle that Sergeant Ruthven got the Victoria Cross. This is the only VC from the battalion in the war at that time. And then what was happening was peaceful penetration during the summer, where the Australians really put the pressure on the Germans by these small bite-sized attacks, sometimes at night, often without covering barrage and that. And at that time, the only thing that the Germans, who are now becoming really demoralized and depleted, could respond with was shelling, and particularly the use of poison gas. And it was in one of these occasions that a gas shell went off, and my grandfather didn't have his mask on, and so that was his fourth wounding. Back up to northern France, patched up again, back to the front, and he rejoined the battalion in September, just as we were now starting. We'd gone through Mont Saint Quentin, and we were going through the various stages of the Hindenburg line, so towards the finishing line there.
Now, George also won the military medal. What were the circumstances about that award?
Indeed. Well, it was after he had returned for this final time in September 1918. The battalion was tasked with taking the Beau Revoir reserve line. So really, this was the last line of defense in the Hindenburg lines. There were 3 different sections, and this was the last part of the 3rd section. Beyond that lay open countryside all the way to the German border. So this was the last nut to crack. So on the 3rd of October, the battalion was tasked with taking the high ground close to Beau Revoir. And during that attack, 11 men were killed, including George's C Company commanding officer, Captain Braithwaite, who was a very, very popular officer within the group, and it had quite a profound impact on the men. And how should we say, they didn't let his death go unpunished. They took I wouldn't say they took no prisoners, but it was a very bloody affair that took place. So that was on the 3rd of October. The following day, the orders came down, and C Company were tasked with taking the first objective, which was just a road that ran perpendicular across where they were going. And they managed to get there without too much bother. They got to their point, and then from that point, then A and D companies were to go through them to go on to take the main objective up by Genève and Ponchot. And it was during this that there was some heavy casualties, both from shelling and machine gun fire, and including the stretcher bearers. So they were being killed out in the open. So I'm now going to read from the citation that came out. So this is on the 4th of October 1918. It says, "When volunteer stretcher bearers were called for, Private Stevens went out to the assistance of the wounded in broad daylight. He had to cross exposed and bullet-swept ground in close proximity to the enemy posts, but worked for hours unremittingly, succoring his wounded comrades and carrying them back to shelter. In the performance of this work, he showed absolute fearlessness and a cool courage of self-sacrifice that had a marked effect on the morale of all he came in contact with." So for this, he was awarded the military medal on what actually turned out to be the last engagement by the 22nd in the war, and what actually turned out to be the penultimate day for the Australian Corps as a whole. So that was his military medal there. So, but his service record doesn't really finish with that, because he after the Australian Corps got relieved and the Americans came in for they had some well-earned rest. George and Charles were both went on leave. They went back to England. George picked up where he'd left off before. Then on the 11th of November 1918, Armistice Day, church bells were all ringing, and that the two of them probably said, "Right, we've done our bit now," and so they went AWOL again, this time for 4 weeks.
Goodness.
But this time they were not so lucky, and and they got apprehended or gave themselves up. I don't know which one, but this time they got a court martial, and both of them got 40 days field punishment number 2 for their troubles. So George then returned back to back to the unit eventually, who are now in Belgium. And then he was part of the 6th quota for the return to Australia. The first ones to go were the boys from Gallipoli, so they looked at sort of service. So George was in the 6th, went back to England, and in June 1919 he got married to Minnie at in East Twickenham. And then they both returned back to Australia and Port Melbourne in December of that year.
Goodness. Now, Greg, George also had other relatives in the war. Who were they, and what did they do?
Yes, indeed. Well, first of all, he had two uncles. So this is from his mother's side. So his mother, Polly Pinkerton, had 2 brothers, William and Walter. Polly was the eldest at 40, and but next one was William Pinkerton. So he was 38, but he actually was an example of the type of soldier that the Australians were looking for at the beginning of the war, which were either those that were either in the army or the militia, or had previous experience elsewhere. And with in William's case, he'd served with the Bethune's Mounted Infantry in the Boer War. So that was very much going out, sort of scouting type work. So even though he was 38, fairly elderly, he was someone that they were looking for. So William joined the 5th Battalion, and he sailed from Melbourne in October 1914 on the Orvieto. So as many people know, the Orvieto was the one that also took the general staff, including Bridges, Major General Bridges at that time. So they were destined for England. So I don't know how many of the listeners do know that originally the AIF was heading for England, but a lot of it the reason why they went to Canada was, I'm sorry, begging your pardon, not Canada, to Egypt, was because the Canadians had taken all the camps out in Salisbury Plain, and there was a worry that they would be out in the cold during the winter, so they were told to stop at Egypt. So they did, and then of course Gallipoli happened, and so William Pinkerton, as part of the 5th Battalion, sailed for the peninsula. Now the 5th were in the 2nd wave ashore, and they were tasked with going across the rough and difficult terrain towards 400 Plateau. And they got up to the vicinity of what became known as Lone Pine and also Johnston's Jolly. Now, during the research again, I was reading, and then I came across what for me was a fascinating piece. So this is Charles Bean writing in volume 1 of his official history. He talked about Lieutenant Derham, who was of the 5th Battalion. He said that's Derham, sent forward a trustworthy scout, Private Pinkerton, upon the dangerous task of reconnoitring the forward slope of the plateau. After 15 minutes, Pinkerton came back with the news that no such line existed in front of them. The only sign of what might be a firing line was a half a dozen Australians whom they saw lying in rifle pits scratched on the summit of Johnston's Jolly. So Pinkerton had come back with that information, but as we found out later, Pinkerton was killed later that day. He was killed in action. And like many at that particular time, in that 1st and 2nd wave that got to the point that the Australians never really went before, so they got up to the plateau on that first morning. Many of the men were never found. So William Pinkerton is commemorated up on the Lone Pine Memorial. Now, through this research, I was able, and one of the tangible benefits of this thing is meeting some great people, including relatives that we never knew existed. and one of which was a lady by the name of Maureen, who is now in her 90s, and she's a granddaughter of William Pinkerton, and we've become great friends, since. And she actually told me, she said, World War I was ever present in my youth. The walls of my grandmother's house were where we all resided were decorated with war images. William in uniform, assorted generals, battle scenes, flags of other nations, and overseeing it all, a very severe Queen Victoria, who Maureen told me he thought she was her third grandmother. Anyway, he said, I sent her this information and she was astounded by it. And she said, having recently read Bean's account, my grandmother's grief and unhappiness might have been eased, knowing that his sacrifice had meaning and that William was regarded as a hero to those that knew him. So she said to me, she said, Greg, this information's come through 100 years too late, unfortunately.
And it's amazing how you still learn of new information in regard to your relatives. Now,
yes.
we're recording this on the 24th of April, so obviously tomorrow is Anzac Day. So William's history, 108 years later, he was actually killed in action on Anzac Day or the day after?
He was actually on Anzac Day in the evening.
Day.
Yes, on the 25th. Yeah, so if you look at his records, that it actually says the 25th. Now, as it happened at that time, information never got back straight away, and he did not appear until the 42nd casualty list, and that was back in, I think it was in June of 1915, so almost 2 months afterwards. And then my grandfather, he enlisted 3 weeks after the news. So you can imagine what the air must have been like in the kitchen as he told his mum what he was about to do. So that was William. And then William had a younger brother called Walter Pinkerton. He was 30 when he enlisted in 1916. And he was a former caretaker of the Port Melbourne Cricket Club. Now, family folklore for my dad, for hearing about, he said that he thought that his dad, i.e. George, played cricket at the MCG. I thought, he must be, because he did like his cricket. But I think probably looking into now, it was probably the PMCG where he played his cricket. Anyway, he was assigned to the 23rd Battalion, and he was in the 12th Reinforcements, and he joined. The 23rd Battalion were part of the 6th Brigade in the 2nd Division. So they were one of these battalions that were alternating with George. He joined the unit in the Fleur sector of the Somme, and during the winter time, with all the mud and that's when men were starting to go down with trench foot, and Walter was one of these. So he contracted trench feet, and he was evacuated back to England in January 1917. And a bit like George, he didn't go back straight away. He spent most of 1917 in England recovering and training again. And he did not return to the 23rd Battalion until the 22nd of September. Now, this is when 3rd Ypres was in full swing. And the Australian Corps was now focused very much on the area around Broodsinder and the Broodsinder Ridge. And then on the 9th of October, there was a battle known as the Battle of Polkapel, and the 23rd Battalion were on the right-hand flank of this whole attack, of which Walter was part of this. But sadly, Walter was also killed in action. He was killed on the 9th of October 1917, and he now rests in Hagel Dump Cemetery, which is to the west of Belgium. So both of the Pinkerton boys were killed. But I'm delighted and very proud to say that the Pinkerton family have done a great job in remembering their former ancestors. So William was honoured at the Australian War Memorial Last Post ceremony back in July 2019, and the family also honoured Walter just a couple of months ago in February 2023. So that was lovely to see that, and I was able to watch both live on YouTube. And in both cases, the eulogy was read by then current serving members of the Australian Armed Forces. So that was a nice touch. And there's a third relative as well, but this is by marriage. So I mentioned to you about Charles Samways. This is my grandfather's partner in crime that went AWOL together.
AWOL.
Well, anyway, so my grandfather was a bit later going back to Australia because of getting married. But by the time he got back, which was towards the end of 1919, Charles was already seeing George's younger sister Daisy. And the following year, in 1920, the two of them got married. So Charles then became brother-in-law. So when I was over, when was it? I think it was 2015. I was over in Australia doing research and visiting people. I tried to track down relatives of Charles, but sadly, their son Frank Samways was the last of the line, and he died in 2007. But what I did find out, and that for those people that live in North Melbourne might be familiar with the Gracie Street Lost Dogs Home. So he used to go down. They had no children, Frank. So he used to go down there a lot, and he left a lot of his estate to the Gracie Street home. And in 2012, they opened a new veterinary centre there, which is called the Frank Samways Veterinary Clinic. So that's there, and I've been along there and had my photograph taken in front of it. So that was a nice ending there. And then also just finishing up on Charles. I was able to track down one of his mates that had his medals and war memorabilia. This was after he died. He didn't know what to do with it, so he sent them to the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne. And I went down into the vault, saw those, but it was only about 1 or 2 years ago I got a note from them saying that they have now made taken part of the collection, and it's now up in display in the main museum, including a photograph of my grandfather as well. So, so my grandfather's now made it into the museum part of the
Shrine of Remembrance.
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Now, your website is really a great trove of knowledge about the 22nd, and also just historic aspects. Like I said, I went and looked at Broadmeadows camp. But where can people go to find out more on your project and the 22nd Battalion?
Yes, well, the actual title is called Following the 22nd, but the URL is www.anzac-22nd, so it's 22nd-battalion.com. And so that's up there. But also, I'm delighted to say that a number of years ago I was contacted by the National Library of Australia, who are putting together a digital archive, and it's now part of their Pandora digital archive system. So once I've long gone, hopefully it will be there for future generations to look at. But so you have to look for Following the 22nd. It comes there. We also have a Facebook page which I administer, which is, at the time, it commemorated things that happened 100 years to the day, but now it's more to do with news such as the Anzac Day parade that the association is taking place in, other commemorative events, or some people will post photographs and memorabilia that they've just located in the attic or something like that. So that is Anzac 100 22nd Battalion. If anyone wants to look at that, there is a Twitter page, but really that was only used during the commemorative period, so very little on that. And then finally, there is a 22nd Battalion Association, which is managed by Ian Russell, he's the son of Fred Russell, who's one of the Gallipoli originals, and between the two of them, they have been secretary of the association for over 100 years.
Goodness, yeah, wonderful.
So that's that's nice. So Ian's probably, as we record this now, he's tucked up in bed because he's got an early start tomorrow, and he'll be marching to the shrine tomorrow.
Yes.
And of course, if anyone wants to contact me directly, they can get my information via the website.
Wow.
Following the 22nd website.
And Greg, what are your plans for Anzac Day 2023?
Well, I will be logging on here online and looking. So, and then a bit of quiet reflection. So I'm not going to any particular services this time. I've managed to been up to the Cenotaph where we've done that, and I've also been down to Weymouth, which is where one of the biggest camps was, and so there was very much an Anzac focus on that particular time. One thing I'm yet to do, and it's still on my to-do list, and that is to go across to Villers-Bretonneux. I haven't done the dawn service over there yet, so that's for another year, I think.
Following the 22nd. Greg, thank you so much for your time today. It's really appreciated.
Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed talking to you today. Thank you.
That's the podcast for today. You can find links to Following the 22nd on our Facebook page and our podcast. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews help others find our podcast. You can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service. Lest we forget.